Let me begin this evening by thanking you, Deacon Allen, for those very kind but brief words of introduction. If there's one thing that will make me want to crawl under a table, it's for someone to start giving a long introduction. Just thank you for getting right to the point, and thank you for your friendship, and thank you for your leadership. The only thing I hold against you in this program is that the picture that you put of me in this program was 27 pounds ago. I've lost 27 pounds and I'm proud of it. But to my friend, our leader, the senior pastor of this historic church, the legendary Thomas L. Walker.
Yeah.
As I look back over my career, and it's now been a lot of years, as I look back over my career and just think about all the accomplishments that God has enabled me to reach, I try to connect the dots and see the individuals who have helped me along the way. And certainly it's those men and women who taught me in high school and elementary school and when I went to college years ago. But other than my teachers, one singular person that has probably helped me more than any other person is Reverend Walker. I say that very sincerely. He's heard me say that before. Many of you have heard me say that before, and I say that very sincerely. When I came out of law school and came back to Wilson, I engaged in a little practice of law. We had an office here in Rocky Mount on Howard Street, and somehow I was a little bit more interested in civil disobedience and protest and trying to right injustices. And I had an ally in Thomas L. Walker. I wanted to get involved in voter registration and get out the vote efforts in Wilson and Rocky Mount. I had an ally in Thomas Walker. We were tied together at the hip, and we did so much. I remember when Walker and J.O. Thorne ran for county commissioners, they registered literally thousands of voters here in Rocky Mount. Some of you remember that, and I could call the roll. Deacon that lived on Virginia Avenue used to be the teacher, the principal. Tyson, Deacon, his wife, Mrs. Tyson, and I'm calling names now unnecessarily, but we registered thousands of people here in Rocky Mount, and I remember it so well. So thank you, Reverend Walker, for that. To the Ebenezer family, to the deacons who make this event happen every year, to the EBC choir, and certainly to the elected officials. They have already been recognized, but I recognize each one of you again. Categorically, I won't call you by name, but thank all of you for the incredible work that each of you does in your space. To the students, to the oratorical students who came up here a few moments ago, weren't they great? Yeah. And most of all, to all of you who have come out this evening. This is Martin Luther King weekend. We struggled long and hard to get this day declared as a national holiday. I remember when Senator Jesse Helms, Eddie Lawrence remembers it so well, when Jesse Helms was adamant in keeping us from getting this declared a national holiday. But now it is a holiday, and there are programs just like this taking place all across, not just the state, programs like this taking place all across the country. It seems that every year the programs are getting more and more. I probably got more than 80 invitations for this weekend from right here in Eastern North Carolina, and so I've accepted 13 of those. This is number 6 of 13. But I will say, it's the only one that I agreed to be the keynote speaker for the occasion. Because I want to be able to come in and do my little 5 or 10 minutes and stay about 30 minutes and then go on to the next one. But I was honored to be called to be your keynote speaker this evening. To understand the life and work of Martin Luther King Jr., you've got to connect the dots. You just can't say, this is a Baptist preacher who got out in the street and protested and went to jail and did this and did that, came to Rocky Mount in November of 1962 and gave a famous speech in 1963. That doesn't adequately describe the life of Dr. King and what he has meant to this nation. To understand Dr. King, you've got to go back to 1860. Not 1960, I'm going to talk about 1960, but you've got to go back to 1860. There were 10,000 slaves in Edgecombe County. There were 5,000 slaves in Nash County. Another 10,000 slaves in Halifax County. There were literally more than 25,000 slaves within 15 or 18 miles of where we sit right now. And slavery was brutal. 4 million slaves in the South, 300,000 in North Carolina. Slavery was ungodly, it was sinful, but yet Southern plantation owners embraced slavery and wanted it to continue forever. And finally, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was running for president. And the Southern plantation owners became quite nervous, believing that if Abraham Lincoln won the election, that he would take away their property, would take away their slaves and cause their empire to crumble. And so they pushed back against Lincoln and did not want him to become president. Lincoln won the election of 1860, became president of the United States. And back during those days, when you were elected in November, you did not get inaugurated until the following March. Now you get inaugurated, as we all know, on January 20th. But immediately after Lincoln was elected, South Carolina said, we're out of here. We don't want to have anything to do with the United States. Mississippi did the same thing. The next day, Florida did the same thing. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By the time you looked around, 7 southern states had left the Union. So we're forming our own country. We're going to call it the Confederate States of America. We're going to have our flag. We're going to have our president. We're even going to have our own money, our currency. We're going to have our military. We're going to stand up a military so that we can defend ourselves. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th of 1865. And then 4 more states said, well, we better do the same thing. We're going to get out of here too. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee. By the time you looked around, there were 11 southern states that were rebelling against the Union, not wanting to have anything to do with Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War breaks out, North against the South. And it was a brutal civil war, brother against brother. Thousands of people were killed in the war on both sides of the battle. Finally, in 1862, Lincoln was weary. He was tired of the war. He felt that it was unnecessary. He was disgusted that these 11 southern states had pulled out of the Union, which they had no right to do. And he issued a document called a Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Preliminary Proclamation said, states, you 11 states, I will give you 100 days to come home. And if you are not home by January 1st of 1863, I'm going to sign a sheet of paper. I'm going to call it an Emancipation Proclamation, and your slaves will be free. And those 11 southern states said to Lincoln, you cannot do that. We are no longer part of your country. This is our property. We paid for our property. We are entitled to our property. The slaves are ours. You cannot do that. And Lincoln replied by saying, no, but we are at war, and I am the commander-in-chief of the military, and I have the absolute right to do anything and everything within my power to win the war. And I'm telling you, 100 days, you better come home. If not, I'm taking your slaves. The South ignored Lincoln, and sure enough, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln did what he said he was going to do. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But here was the problem with the Emancipation Proclamation. It only applied to the 11 states that were fighting against the United States. It didn't apply to what we call the border states. There were other states that were not fighting against the United States, but still they had slaves living in those states: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia. Those were the border states. And so the Emancipation Proclamation had some defects and it did not get the job done. And so the war continues to wage. Lincoln is re-elected in 1864, and right after his re-election, he decided that I'm going to settle the legality of the end of slavery by amending the Constitution. We're going to put a 13th Amendment in the Constitution that makes it part of our organic law that slavery shall not be tolerated in the United States. And so on January 31st of 1865, right after Lincoln was re-elected, there was a bill passed in Congress to add a provision to the Constitution doing away with slavery. But to amend the Constitution, it requires a certain percentage of the states in order to agree to make it happen. And so Lincoln sent this 13th Amendment, proposed 13th Amendment around to the states to get them to ratify the amendment. And while the amendment was going around to the states, Lincoln himself was murdered on April 15th of 1865, did not see the realization of the 13th Amendment. But notwithstanding that, the 13th Amendment finally passed. It passed North Carolina on December 4th of 1865, and the state of Georgia on December 6th of 1865. And at that moment, every slave in this country was free. There was no question about the legality of the freedom of the slaves. And so the period then began of what we call Reconstruction. Black people became registered voters and they got engaged in their communities. Right here in eastern North Carolina, you had 3 counties that were majority African American: Halifax County, Warren County, Edgecombe County. These counties were majority African American. And after the black people got the right to vote, and women couldn't vote during those days, and that's a speech for another day. But after the men became registered voters, they started doing great things. They started electing African Americans to office. The first congressman was from Warren County, John Hyman, elected to Congress, and the next black congressman was from Enfield, where I was sometime today or yesterday, this morning, okay. Congressman from Enfield, James Edward O'Hara, was elected to Congress. And then from Henderson, where I'll be tomorrow morning, Henry Plummer Cheatham was elected to Congress. And then the final congressman was George H. White from Newbern and Tarboro. That is what happened during Reconstruction. And black communities started organizing and getting their communities organized and preparing for the future. And that's when black colleges and universities began to spring up. Shaw University and St. Augustine's and Fayetteville State and the other great colleges in North Carolina began to spring up. But finally in 1900, it became apparent that black people were not going to stop voting. They were not going to be intimidated. And so the North Carolina legislature decided to pass some very discriminatory laws. Don't you think that the discriminatory laws that they've been passing for the last 4 or 5 years are the only bad laws that have been adopted? They adopted the poll tax and the literacy test in 1900. As a result of that, black progress came to an end. It came to a screeching halt because of the literacy test. In order to vote, you had to be able to read and write. And it didn't matter, Dr. Allen, if you had a PhD or not. Even if you could read or write, they would not give you your credentials in order to vote. And so starting in 1900, there were no African Americans registered to vote. There were none elected to office anywhere in North Carolina or throughout the South. And it was a very dark and difficult period. But as the years went on, a lot of great things happened. It's just the right to vote did not happen. But a lot of good things began to happen. Colleges began to do great things, and African Americans began to succeed in so many ways. And now I'm going to fast forward to 1960. I talked about 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. Now let's jump over to 1960. In 1960, segregation is the law of the land. Jim Crow laws, separate accommodations for the races. In 1960, John Kennedy runs for president. Kennedy goes to black people who lived in the North and said, vote for me, I need you. If you would support me, I will bring forth a civil rights bill that would bring down the barriers that divide our communities. He went to the few black people who were registered in the South, and there weren't many, but he went to a few African Americans in the South and said, vote for me for president. And he reminded them that he was a Catholic and that there was a lot of resentment against him because he was a Catholic, and many people said that America was not ready for a Catholic president. But it was the African American vote in 1960 that pushed President Kennedy to the victory line. And John F. Kennedy became president of the United States of America. And black America was very happy. I remember my parents were very happy about that day. But the bad news is that nothing happened. He became president, sworn in January 20th of 1961, and nothing happened. And Dr. King and others said, what's the problem here? Dr. King had just come on the scene in 1955 as a leader down in Montgomery, Alabama. And King had led the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was beginning to get recognized as a national leader. And so in 1960, King organized some leaders. They went to the White House and talked to President Kennedy and said, hey, look, what's the problem here? You told us that if we believed in you and voted for you and you were elected president, that you would do what President Eisenhower tried to do and didn't do, that you would give us a civil rights bill. Kennedy said to him, well, you don't understand. Now is not the time to do that. I understand what you're saying. I'm from Massachusetts. I understand what you're saying about the South, but now is not the time. The problem is that I've got a fool down in Cuba named Fidel Castro who's threatening the United States, and he's a friend of the Soviet Union, and I've got to put all of my energy on Cuba. And I'm trying to innovate. I'm trying to send a man to the moon over the next 10 years, and if we can do this moonshot, then they can bring great innovation to America, and we cannot get sidelined right now with civil rights. And that's when Martin Luther King left the White House, very disgusted that President Kennedy had disappointed the African American community. And so he went back to Atlanta and began organizing the civil rights movement. One of the first places he came was Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Booker T. Washington High School. I was there. My daddy made me come that night. We were sitting right on the front row. I can see it now. We came to Rocky Mount to Booker T. We sat there and we listened to this man speak. And the speech that he gave, it is reported, was similar to the speech that he gave a year later at the March on Washington. And so this is where he had his rehearsal, if you will, as he was beginning to launch his career. And so finally, King said, we're going to have a March on Washington. If Kennedy is not going to do the right thing, we've got to make him respond. And so King and A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and Roy Wilkins and Floyd McKissick and many others got together and decided we're going to have a massive march on Washington. And King said, well, we're going to have it, but I'm going to give the final speech. I'm going to give the concluding speech, and let's get it going. And by this time, President Kennedy got word that a massive march was being organized. And that's when Kennedy called King to the White House and sat him down and said, America's not ready for this. You don't need to bring 250,000 people to Washington trying to make us do anything. You've got to understand that I am your friend. I know now is not the time, but I am your friend, and I'm going to get you a civil rights bill, but let's call off the march. And King said, Mr. President, we've got to go forward with the march. And when King left, he started thinking about the thing. He said, well, if we march and we get the Congress and the President mad with us, we may not ever get a civil rights bill. But if we don't do it, if we call off the march, and they don't do anything, then we're going to look like fools. So what are we going to do? And so all of the black leaders got together in a room, and John Lewis tells us this story all the time. They sat there and they tried to figure it out. And they figured that what they had to do was to go forward with the march. August 28, 63, very hot day. I was there, 16 years old. Massive people from all across the country came to Washington demanding of President Kennedy a strong civil rights bill. After they left Washington, the mood of the country was in favor of civil rights. America was embarrassed to the world because of the way it treated African Americans in this country. And so the country was in a dilemma. It was in a downward spiral, kind of like it is today. And it needed healing, and it needed to rebound and to take the country in another direction. And as they were pondering, trying to figure out what they were going to do about a civil rights bill, finally President Kennedy came out and said, okay, we are going to have a civil rights bill. And a few days later, September 15th, 1963, after the march was August 28th, 3 weeks later, September 15th, 1963, as the nation was preparing itself for a civil rights debate in Congress, 4 little girls were bombed at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. I've been to that church. I walked up and down those steps. It's a church like this with steps on the side, and these pretty little girls were coming up the steps from Sunday school into the sanctuary when the bomb went off. And those 4 little girls were murdered. And because of that, President Kennedy was embarrassed. I imagine he was regretful that he had been so slow in bringing forth a civil rights bill. And finally, he decided to support a civil rights bill. And then a few days later, after they introduced the bill into Congress, President Kennedy decides to go to Dallas, Texas for a presidential visit. And while he is there, he's in the back seat of his presidential limousine, riding through the streets of Dallas, Texas. And at that moment, President Kennedy's head was blown off, and he was assassinated. But notwithstanding that, the Civil Rights Bill was introduced. It was beginning to get debated in Congress. President Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson becomes President Johnson. And President Johnson calls King into the Oval Office and basically apologizes for the inaction and the slow action on the part of President Kennedy and others in power. And President Johnson said to the Congress, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long, end of quote. And so the Civil Rights Bill was debated in Congress. Dr. King was loved by some, he was despised by others. But finally, after the Southern filibuster from Southern senators, finally the Civil Rights Bill was enacted into law, July of 1964. And while Dr. King does not deserve all of the credit for the Civil Rights Bill, and I would be foolish to even suggest that he deserves all of the credit, he was certainly the indisputable, the undisputable leader of the Civil Rights Movement. Because of that, it was finally the law of the land that you could not segregate based on race in public accommodations. And I raised my voice when I said public because I want to make a point about that. The Civil Rights Bill was about public accommodations. It wasn't about voting. It was about bus stations and train stations and bowling alleys and hotels and motels and restaurants and places where the public goes. Basically saying that you cannot segregate in those places by race. The train station here in Rocky Mount. I don't know if you've been down there lately, but it used to be, segregated at the train station by race. The bus station in Rocky Mount segregated by race. The 64 Civil Rights Bill was about eliminating laws that would allow segregation by race in public accommodations. And so King is now becoming a world leader. He is called to Oslo, Norway to get the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a big deal. He was conferred the Nobel Peace Prize in early December of 1964. And we were so proud. Some in America were so proud of Martin Luther King. And King comes back to this country after receiving the prize. He gets a large monetary gift. And King was not a rich man. Young people want you to know that. King was like many of our pastors who work from sun up to sun up. Sometimes they get paid and sometimes they don't. And when they do get paid, it's not enough. But they just keep on going and they keep on going. And that's what Dr. King did. Rem Hines said, amen. I don't know what that means. But he kept on going. And so when he went to the White House after getting the Nobel Peace Prize, Johnson called him in. This is a very important meeting. And it gets underreported. It doesn't get talked about a whole lot. But Johnson called him in and said, Dr. King, President Kennedy is not here anymore. I know you were very dissatisfied with the fact that he drug his feet and didn't really get this thing going like you wanted to. But we've got it now. We've got the Civil Rights Bill, and your people can now be restful and be assured that they will not be discriminated against by race. We've got the Supreme Court case from 1954 that integrates the schools, and now we've got the 64 Civil Rights Bill that now opens up public accommodations. You know, your community ought to be happy. And Dr. King retorted to President Johnson, Mr. President Johnson, thank you for that. We are grateful for all that you have done to get this bill passed, but now it's time for a voting rights bill. And President Johnson, I guess, I'm making this up now, but I guess he turned pink and then he turned red. And then he said, what did you say? And Dr. King said, no, I'm serious, Mr. President. I'm just as serious as I can be. Black people in the South cannot vote. Mr. President, you're from Texas, you know that. Black people can't vote in North Carolina, South Carolina, and other southern states because of the literacy test that was put on the books back in 1900. We've got to have a voting rights bill. President Johnson said, Dr. King, you are a PhD, you are a theologian, you're an intelligent man. Certainly you understand the dilemma that I'm in as president. I have just lost all of these political friends that I used to have because of the Civil Rights Bill. And I have this war in Vietnam going on right now that is about to strangle my presidency. And I've got some other things that I want to do. If you just work with me, I want to create Medicare so that old people, senior citizens, got to be careful how you say old, because I got a card in my pocket. Some of you do too. He said, but just hold your horses, Dr. King. Just work with me. I want to get Medicare for senior citizens. I want to get Medicaid for poor people. I want to get a lot of programs that can help your community. And if we start talking about voting for African Americans, it's going to jeopardize everything that I have in my mind. And King had a dilemma, whether to go for voting rights or whether to take a step back and allow President Johnson to do it his way. But King had a vision. He said, no, Mr. President, we need the vote and we need it now. And that's when President Johnson said, I am sorry. You're not going to be able to get me to support it at this time. And King got up from the president's desk and walked to the door. And John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who is like that with Martin King, who I serve with every day, has told me time and time again that when King got to the door of the Oval Office, that's when President Johnson kind of got his attention and made eye contact with him, and winked his eye at him, and said, make me do it. Not in a negative way, but in a positive way. Amen. Make me do it. And that's when King left, went to Atlanta for Christmas, and on January 1st, he headed to Selma, Alabama. Miss Amelia Boynton, who just died a couple of years ago, I had the honor of meeting her. She was 104, 105 years old. Invited him to Selma. Why Selma? Because there was not a single black person in that county registered to vote. Not a single one. King went to Selma, Alabama, and organized a brand new movement called the Selma to Montgomery March. And they left Brown Chapel Church that day, 2,500 people, and they started walking to Montgomery. When they got to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with violence. Violence from sheriff's deputies and violence from highway state troopers. They were met violently on the bridge and they were turned back. They went back to, John Lewis was beat on the head. He says that's why he stutters today, because of the violence that he sustained. Went back to Brown Chapel Church and they decided to come back 2 or 3 weeks later and try it again. They made a telephone call to the White House. That's when President Johnson telephoned Governor George Wallace and said, you know what, Wallace? I don't like what they're doing either. But guess what? They have a right to do it. And when those marches come back 3 weeks from now and go to that bridge, your troopers need to protect them and not hurt them. And so, 3 weeks later, they head to the bridge, and this time the troopers had to stand at attention when the marchers came by. And by the time they reached the state capitol, there were 25,000 marchers in line. But Martin King had made a call for people of goodwill to come from other places in the country to come down and to help out with the march. And a white lady from Detroit, Michigan, named Viola Luizio, had responded to the call and had come to Selma to assist with the march. She had a car. She left her husband and 3 children at home. She came to Selma to help with the march. When the march was over, she used her car to shuttle these marchers back to Selma. And as she was headed back to Selma, the Ku Klux Klan, yes, the KKK, ran her off the road, and she was murdered. And because of that, President Johnson was saddened. All of a sudden, he didn't care about his re-election. He didn't care about anything but his legacy. And he got on the telephone and called Mr. Luizio in Detroit and got him on the phone and said, I am very hurt, I'm troubled, I'm very saddened by the death and the murder of your wife. But if it's any consolation to you, sir, I want you to know that her dying shall not be in vain. And because of that, Lyndon Johnson contacted Martin Luther King and said, I've changed my mind. I'm going to support a Voting Rights Act. I'm going to do it now. And on March 15th of 1965, as the cameras were setting up in the White House to allow President Johnson to go on live TV, I'm told that he was, as I was sitting there a minute ago, writing some notes, trying to get ready to go on television. And when the camera started rolling, he looked squarely in the camera and said,